All right.
This is Peggy from RAR. So today our guest is George van Hoegaerden, so another friend from Europe. Thank you so much, George, to be here with us.
Thanks for having me.
So George is managing director at Method 41. So he advises leaders on how to improve the efficacy of policy, capital, and innovation. So we're very fortunate to have you with us today to discuss the new normal in financial services.
I know. Let's get started.
Okay, so let's get started with the first question. So from your perspective, what would be some of the major lasting impacts of COVID or the crisis on the financial services industry?
Well, you can never really predict how humanity is going to behave as a group, but I can only talk about what should happen, right? And what should happen is that COVID-19 is a signal that nature controls us, not us controlling nature. And that means that we essentially have to learn how to play nature's game, not humanity's game, right? Do we actually understand what nature's first principles are?
Yeah, exactly.
Do we understand what we're here to do on this planet? We have all these systems in place in policy, capital, and innovation, but how many of those systems actually subscribe to the principles of nature? None of them do, I discovered. So the reason why we have a poor response to COVID-19 is that for many years, we have accumulated an incompatibility with the way nature behaves. For example, when you see in finance, everybody talks about sustainability and ESG and all these terms. They're all based on sustainability. Sustainability doesn't exist anywhere in the universe, meaning there is no guaranteed sustainability. There's only renewal. And the rules for renewal are fundamentally different than the rules to achieve any kind of sustainability. So the point is that if we want to create a proper response, either to COVID-19 systemically or in the future, then we have to obey to the rules of nature. And it's interesting to see how few people actually investigate how nature works. Let me give you one example. The world revolves around the theory of relativity Einstein discovered 100 years ago. Yet none of the systems by which we manage ourselves are systems of relativity. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
We create systems of absolutism that are supposed to manage human relativity. That's an incompatibility that creates a lot of chaos, right? And that chaos we're facing today.
So you're focused a lot on policy, and to your point, it's interesting to see very often regulations are absolute versus relativity. So do you see some changes coming up on certain regulations following the crisis?
Well, I see a lot of interest in my work, and you know the problems that we face in society are in essence winds in my sail, right? And my sail is designed not to help me, not to enrich me, but to build better systems for humanity. That's my interest, right? So what I see is that there's a lot of interest in some pretty prominent places. And you'd be astounded about, you know, the level of importance of people who are now scratching their heads about the same thing I just talked about. Why is it that we in the United States, for example, have the worst response to COVID-19 in the world? And then we can talk about how we don't like to be controlled as human beings because we're supposedly free and our freedom is a free for all. We cannot be constrained and all that kind of stuff. The reality really is that 70% of the Americans are addicted to prescription drugs, which means that they have a not so effective immune system. And by the way, of those 70%, about 45% have two addictions to separate drugs that they cannot live without. So we can say that the excellence of humanity is suddenly defined by people who live the longest, perhaps, even though we don't live the longest on a world perspective, right? Our average age is about 78 and somewhat in decline. The reality is that our excellence cannot be defined by how long we live, but how strong we live, if that's the right way to phrase it. So again, what that reminds us of is that nature has set the rules for our renewal already. It's very authoritarian. We don't get to decide how long we live individually or as a species. And by the way, a common fly has lived already 16 times longer than a human being. A common fly with almost zero cognitive ability. So we have something to prove here. We have something to prove that we as humans, equipped with unique intelligence, can actually build better systems for ourselves to outlive a common fly.
So jumping on that, so if you look at the global financial system and looking at the, the stability or instability, you mentioned in the US the number of people who are addiction to prescription drugs. So what do you see first in terms of the place maybe of the US in this global financial order and the overall stability or instability in the global order?
Well, I mean, the stability is related to the fact you can improve stability by improving your adherence to the rules of nature. And what I mean by that is that finance is a very important instrument in society, perhaps underestimated by some, because finance is the arbitrage of the fractal expansion of humanity. If I'm an investor, I decide by my investment thesis what the theory is of what I can discover, right? Reverting back to the Albert Einstein quote, right? So as an investor, I set the theory. That investment then goes into a company that decides how humanity expands. So if I decide to invest in a drug and that drugs help me combat COVID-19, then I've done something to sustain humanity in a certain way. So investments and the model by which we use investment strategies define the stability, not just of the financial system, because I don't care about the stability of the financial system that much. I care about the stability of humanity and the regenerative capability and excellence of humanity. And that is what we should all care about. So we shouldn't care about, the efficacy necessarily of policy or the efficacy of capital or the efficacy of innovation. We should care about what all those disciplines do to improve human adaptability to nature's entropy, right? So these systems are a consequence of a humanitarian goal. The goal is, how do we regenerate the excellence of humanity? And if we regenerate the excellence of humanity in the best way possible, we then fight off the entropy. The entropy is the decline of energy available on this planet, which means diseases and climate change and all these other things. That's all in the same bucket of entropy, right? Nature defines that entropy, that we have a proper response to that entropy. So we build systems of policy, finance, and innovation that should be, but are not today, that should be designed to improve human adaptability to nature's entropy. That is the single focus. So if you're thinking about the disruption, if you will, or the stability of financial systems, then the stability of a financial system is geared directly to its ability to improve human adaptability to nature's entropy. That is stability. Because what we know is that the rule of nature is pretty stable. We can predict pretty much how nature is going to evolve. We've looked at the past 13.72 billion years. We know how our planet and our universe has actually evolved. pretty in a very consistent fashion, right? What we create is financial systems that are very unstable. Why are they unstable? Because they're incompatible with the rules of nature, right? For example, that notion of relativity, right? And there's many other components to it, but
So if you look at what you are mentioning, the fact that by deciding your investment thesis, you're deciding the flow of capital and then what's going to be the focus, looking at competitive positioning and the fact that the crisis might hopefully have made many people rethink their investment thesis, do you see some changes that will come, whether in finance or in other organization or other industry, following COVID in terms of competitive positioning and new flow of capital?
yeah, what I see happening is that I see the first phase is sort of this good karma of ESG, right? But it's a false karma because it's incompatible with the laws of nature, right? Sustainability is incompatible with the renewal that nature dictates, right? So so but the positive thing, of course, is that from an investment perspective, we now are starting to think about, so what is the impact of those investments to people that are affected by those investments? So that's a good thing. There's a bad thing is the thesis, but the good thing is the focus of the thesis. So what I see from a competitive standpoint, back to your question, is that the investment firm that is most closely correlated to the principles of nature will have the competitive advantage, because you know, and I know, that the evolution of humanity is predicated on the evolution of nature, which has already proven itself over 13.72 billion years, as far as we can tell, right? So we know that the alpha you can generate from the fractal expansion of humanity has to be correlated to the expansion of nature. So the point is, how can you create a competitive advantage? Is not by creating another man-made theory of absolutism, but create a theory that correlates to the expansion of nature, so that whatever we invest in has a direct effect on our ability to adapt to nature's entropy, which means that the fractal expansion of finance, the generation of alpha, is directly correlated to nature's alpha.
And I like the way you're framing it. So now if I'm looking at large organizations, large financial institutions that are already today.
Who, by the way, are talking to me.
So
exactly for that purpose, because they are looking at 15, 20, even some of them 50-year investment plans. And how can you build a 50-year investment plan based on sustainability when sustainability doesn't exist anywhere in the universe? So the question then,
yeah, what do you see in that context when you speak with these large financial institutions? What's your recommendations, or do you approach that with them?
Create a strategy of renewal. And the rules of renewal are fundamentally different than the rules of sustainability. So you have a completely different set of strategies associated with how you allocate money and why you allocate money. So your thesis becomes not an ESG thesis, but nature's thesis. So would you, the only thesis that matters.
Would you have an example of what a recommendation would be, for example, to follow this nature thesis versus a sustainability or ESG type thesis?
Well, you invest in, it's like the same discussions you can have about, see, for example, what Shell is doing, right? The gas company, right? They changed themselves from an oil company into now a renewable energy company, right? So instead of having a monolithic focus on a single source of fuel, if you will, now you're repositioning yourself into a regenerative company that can use any type of fuel as input to sell as output to your consumers, And so today, if that's still gas, then you'll sell mostly gas. But in the future, you may sell solar energy, or you may sell heat derived from the earth, or whatever strategy you may have. So you may have a multidisciplinary approach rather than a monolithic approach that is based on the false premise of sustainability. There is no unending supply of oil. You see this happening in Europe, where the Germans are now converting everything to gas, and in Holland, the people that had gas tanks in their car are now forced to basically move to electricity in Tesla cars, because that's the better way to go. So you see this evolution from monolithic energy sources to a myriad of energy sources that is based on the fundamentals of renewal, right? And the only renewable energy source that we have today is sunlight.
Yeah. That's
and so it's a much more stable trajectory to follow, of course. But so what I see, back to your question, and I think your question was, what do you see changing in these large corporations? What I see is that there is an innate want to do good, right? And I write a lot of sort of critical and cynical stuff on my website. It's because my bark is perhaps louder than my bite, but that's, you have to do that to get a little bit of attention, to wake everybody up, right? What are you doing? Why are you doing the things you're doing? But and that's a question my young child used to ask me all the time: why? And we don't ask ourselves that question too many times, but we should. And so when you think about these companies, they're now thinking about, when, for example, I talk about a pension fund. Think about this concept, right? When you look at a pension fund, most people think, oh, that's just where I put my pension, and it sits there and it accrues money, and and I'll get a payout at the end of the year. But the challenge of a pension fund is that, like any other pension fund pretty much in the world, they're producing 7% returns. Well, that's not a great return. And if you get more people getting older and using pension money faster, then that 7% is not going to cut it. So a lot of these pension funds are underwater. So how come that we have an 80% greenfield of innovation? We have tons of money to be deployed, and we can't figure out what the marriage counselor between the two is that produces more than 7% returns. That's a pretty embarrassing statistic. So the question people are starting to ask themselves is, so what do we have to do to create investment strategies that are regenerative?
Yeah.
In a sense that if I put investments, if I allow a pension fund to invest money, is that money then advancing the very members of the pension fund that actually are feeding me? So for example, when you have large I won't mention the names of the big firms I talk to, but if you have an investment strategy, let's say in this case, it's a popular topic in the investment and pension business. If I invest in a tobacco company, then I'm investing in the third leading cause of death of Americans, right? We've now come to terms that is a bad thing. But if I'm investing as a pension fund in something that proclaims to be sustainable, I'm doing the exact same thing. Because nothing in the world is sustainable. Everything is renewable, the inversion of sustainability. Meaning, if I want to generate consistent investment returns for a pension fund, I must have a renewable investment strategy, not a sustainable one.
Thank you. That's very, very enlightening and very thought-provoking. Very much appreciate. appreciate you taking the time. The last question might be a bit lighter. So, in the last few months of COVID, what did you change in terms of habits? Did you pick up new good habits? What's the new George?
Well, I don't know if it's a new George because the devil lives inside, right? But my daily routine would be to get up at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning and run on the beach, and that has been made a little bit more difficult because the access to the beach has been restricted somehow. So my patterns of my daily routine have kind of been uprooted, if you will. I spend a lot more time on, and that's actually a positive thing, is I spend a lot more time on really packaging the way my story needs to be told and heard. And obviously these podcasts and stuff are a way of doing that. The notion of how do you cut through the populism of the crowd, right? When people talk about new norms, right, and what is the new norm, then most of the time what they mean is a downstream evolution of an existing norm. That is what's going to save humanity, right? We have to reinvent our norm, and as Thomas Jefferson used to say, we shouldn't be the old man living in a boy's jacket, right? And that's the point. We have to reinvent that jacket that we live in, and that constrain us, that determine what we can discover, and align that with the principles of nature that we know to be true. The only truth that exists is nature's truth, not ours.
Thank you
Ours
so
is only a proxy.
Thank you for taking the time, Josh, to share your thoughts, your perspective,
Sure.
and definitely your differentiated opinion, which is very, very valuable. And really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
All
Bye-bye.
right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.